Right now, a live stream was playing on my battered laptop. In the top right corner, a red counter lazily blinked. 480,000 viewers online. In the center of the frame, bathed in flawless studio lighting, sat a man. His hair was artfully tousled by a stylist, his pale, aristocratic face framed by the sharp lines of a charcoal blazer from a brand I used to see only in high-end fashion magazines. His long, slender fingers elegantly cradled a glass of ice water. He smiled that faint, weary smile that literary critics had already dubbed the hallmark of true genius. This was Sebastian, my husband, the man whose electricity bills, heating, health insurance, and even that very charcoal blazer had been paid for by my salary as a senior logistics coordinator at a freight terminal. "You see, Beatrice?" he said into his lavalier microphone, his voice, deep, velvety, spellbinding, echoing from my laptop speakers. A true masterpiece is never born out of chaos. A masterpiece is always the child of absolute, sterile, almost monastic solitude. For 7 long years, I lived in a complete vacuum. There was no one around me, no friends, no family, no woman to drag the flight of my mind down to earth with primitive, mundane demands. I deliberately scorched every social tie from my life. I slept on a bare floor, ate whatever chanced to be at hand, went weeks without seeing daylight, and I just wrote. Only under such conditions of total isolation can the human spirit find true freedom to create. The host, Beatrice, a prominent journalist renowned for her sharp, predatory intellect, nodded with a mix of empathy and awe, pressing a hand to her chest. "That is profound self-sacrifice, Sebastian. You quite literally offered up your youth and earthly happiness upon the altar of great art. The world owes you this novel." I sat in our cramped, smoke-stained kitchen on the grim outskirts of the city. Outside, the highway hummed a dreary, monotonous tune. In the corner, our ancient refrigerator rattled, and the air smelled of cheap laundry detergent and cooling vegetable soup. The red, itchy chemical burns on my hands hadn't faded yet. Exactly 2 hours ago, I had finished scrubbing floors and washing panoramic windows in a towering corporate high-rise downtown. It was my 3rd shift in the last 24 hours. I glanced at the screen, then moved the cursor to the adjacent tab of my email client. My index finger hovered over the left mouse button. In the To field, a long snake of addresses stretched out. The editor-in-chief of Modern Review, directors of Grand Books Publishing, heads of the tax audit division, independent literary critics, and board members of the country's largest cultural foundation. Attached to the email was a single encrypted 4-gigabyte archive. No threats, no lengthy feminine grievances, tearful letters, or hysterical accusations. Just cold, soulless numbers, bank transfers, and document metadata. I took a deep breath and clicked Send. At that exact second, viewers in the live chat continued to type at the speed of a machine gun. "He's a god! Such depth of thought! A true prophet of our time, not just a writer!" They didn't know that in less than 10 minutes, this god would turn into the most despised man in the country, and his flawless crystal castle would shatter into sharp, jagged shards that would bury themselves deep into his own skin. But to understand why I did it this way, coldly, calculatedly, and in the most public way possible, we have to go back to the very beginning. To that gray autumn day when I voluntarily agreed to lay my life on the altar of someone else's supposedly great talent. 7 years ago, Sebastian didn't wear custom-tailored suits or lecture audiences about the sterile vacuum of the spirit. He had shoes with worn-down heels, a perpetually wrinkled collar, hollow cheeks, and a massive glowing dream that burned with a manic, almost frightening intensity. We met in a small basement coffee shop where I was working part-time as a barista. Times were brutal. I was a junior majoring in philology, desperately strapped for cash, scrambling to balance morning lectures with exhausting evening shifts behind the espresso machine. My fingers constantly smelled of roasted beans and cheap milk. Sebastian came in every single day, at exactly 4 in the afternoon. He would order the cheapest black coffee on the menu. He clearly couldn't afford anything else. and sit for hours at the furthest corner table beneath a dim, flickering lamp. He never scrolled through a phone or looked around. He wrote with a kind of fury in a thick notebook bound in black leather. Sometimes he would freeze, staring out the window at the sheets of rain, biting his lips until they bled, before plunging back into his writing as if all the demons of hell were hot on his heels. One evening, he left in a hurry and forgot his notebook on the table. I noticed it too late, after his silhouette had already dissolved into the evening fog. The shop was closing, night was falling, and I, giving in to professional curiosity, committed an unforgivable indiscretion. I opened it. On the very first page, written in a sprawling, angular, yet oddly beautiful script, were the words, "The world around us is made of cheap, thick glass and false mirrors. We wander through this labyrinth, seeing only the reflections the masters of this carnival allow us to behold. But I will find the fracture point. I will make this glass facade crack, even if I have to bloody my own hands to do it." I turned the page, then another. They were drafts of what would become his first novel. The prose quite literally breathed with raw, primordial power. It possessed a heavy, dark poetry and a profound, almost terrifying understanding of human loneliness and betrayal. This wasn't the kind of trash modern authors churned out for quick royalty checks. This was literature. Deep, painful, and agonizingly honest. When Sebastian burst into the coffee shop the next morning, out of breath, hair wild, eyes wide with sheer panic, I silently pulled the notebook from beneath the counter and handed it to him. He clutched it to his chest as if it were his own child pulled from a burning building. Did you open it?" he asked hoarsely, searching my face. "I did," I admitted honestly. "Forgive me, but it's breathtaking. You are incredibly talented." Sebastian froze. His pupils dilated, and a strange, almost childlike, vulnerable smile broke across his pale face. He looked at me as if I were the first person on this planet to speak his language. "Do you really mean that?" he asked softly, sitting at the counter. "My father always told me I was a worthless loafer wasting paper. The editors I sent my early short stories to didn't even bother to reply. They called it pretentious gibberish." "They are blind," I replied passionately, driven by youthful idealism and academic enthusiasm. "You have a rare gift. Don't you dare stop." That was my fatal mistake. That day, with a smile on my face, I voluntarily stepped into invisible shackles that would eventually push me to the brink of physical exhaustion. Our romance progressed at a breakneck pace, fueled by the illusion of absolute spiritual kinship. We fancied ourselves characters in a beautiful classic novella, a pragmatic, self-sacrificing young woman and an unrecognized genius poised to upend human consciousness. Within 3 months, we moved in together, combining our meager belongings in a cramped, damp, garden-level studio. The smell of mildew and cheap pasta felt like the romance of poverty back then. The romance evaporated precisely 6 months later, when reality pounded on our door in the form of a landlord demanding 2 months' rent up front and a stack of overdue utility bills. To his credit, Sebastian made a half-hearted attempt to find a job. My pressure and common sense forced him to put together a resume, and thanks to his impeccable command of language, he landed a copywriting gig at a mid-sized ad agency. His corporate career lasted exactly 14 days. I remember that Thursday vividly. I came home from the university exhausted, craving nothing but a hot cup of tea, only to find Sebastian sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, hugging his knees. His office belongings were dumped in a messy pile in the corner. "I can't do it, Sylvia," he said hollowly, refusing to look up. His voice throbbed with a deep, existential agony. "Those non-entities, those narrow-minded managers, they are forcing me to write sales copy for dog food, vinyl windows, and acne creams. They demand that I shorten my sentences, strip out metaphors, make the text simpler so any idiot can grasp it. They are draining my soul, Sylvia. My mind is rotting from the routine. If I stay there for another week, I will never, do you hear me, never be able to write another pure, great line. My talent will die under the weight of this commercial garbage. I walked over to him, knelt on the cold linoleum, and pulled his head tight against my chest. My foolish, infatuated heart broke with pity and a misplaced sense of duty. I saw him as a fragile, rare flower that a harsh, pragmatic world was trying to crush under its heavy boots. I felt that if I didn't save him right then, the world would lose something truly magnificent, and the blame would rest squarely on my shoulders. "Shh, it's okay, my love, calm down," I whispered, running my fingers through his damp hair. "You don't have to go back there, do you hear me? You don't. Your calling is to write books. You are meant to create eternity, not dog food ads. I'll handle it. I'll find a way. We will be fine. Just promise me you won't give up on your novel." Sebastian looked up at me. Now, looking back at that gaze after all these years, I finally see it for what it was. There wasn't a shred of gratitude or reciprocal love in his eyes. There was only the cold, calculated relief of a predator realizing he had found the perfect, submissive prey, willing to feed him with her own lifeblood. "Will you really do that for me, Sylvia?" he asked, his voice a reverent whisper. "You understand that a true creative process requires the right environment, don't you? A writer needs absolute mental hygiene, silence, peace, total freedom from mundane worries. If I am sitting at my desk frantically stressing over how we're going to pay next week's rent, my muse will simply vanish. My prose will become stunted, fearful, and cheap. Real books are written with a light heart." "I will take care of everything," I promised firmly, signing my own death warrant. The next day, I walked into the dean's office and filed for an academic leave of absence, one from which I would never return. My dreams of graduate school and writing a dissertation on Silver Age literature were neatly folded away and buried in the deepest drawer of my memory. I had a new mission now, servicing someone else's genius. I took a job at a massive logistics distribution center on the outskirts of town. The title sounded respectable, Senior Shift Coordinator, but the reality was a 12 to 14-hour daily descent into hell. I stood on my feet in the middle of a vast, freezing concrete terminal where drafts howled through the bays. My job was to orchestrate the flow of multi-ton semi-trucks, cross-reference hundreds of manifests, manage forklift operators, and absorb an endless barrage of profanity from disgruntled drivers and furious supervisors screaming about the slightest delay. By the end of every shift, my legs felt like lead, my lower back burned like wildfire, and my head throbbed from the non-stop clatter of pallet jacks and the roar of diesel engines. Yet, strangely enough, a naive little flame kept burning inside me. Every night, riding the last commuter train home, I would look at my pale reflection in the dirty window and think, "This is just a phase. This is my sacrifice for art. Sebastian will finish the book, the world will recognize him, and everything will change. We'll get out of this misery. I just need to hold on, to be strong for the both of us." However, the warehouse income was nowhere near enough. Sebastian didn't just want to sit at home and write. His demands grew at an alarming rate, and every new whim was elegantly packaged as essential care for the pros. "Sylvia, did you buy these cheap canned goods and generic processed meals again?" He would snap at me irritably as I, barely alive after a grueling day shift, unpacked groceries on our tiny kitchen counter. He didn't even bother to lift himself from his armchair to help me carry the heavy bags. "How many times do I have to tell you? My brain requires high-quality premium fuel, lean proteins, fresh vegetables, artisanal cheeses. Without proper nutrition, brain cells deplete and the creative process stalls. You don't want the third chapter of the novel to turn into a sluggish swamp just because I'm starving on discounted pasta, do you?" I would silently bow my head, swallowing tears of humiliation, and go cook him his proper meal. To satisfy his escalating gastronomic and lifestyle demands, I took on a second job. Every 3 days, right after finishing my primary shift at the warehouse at 6 in the evening, I didn't head home. I transferred to a different subway line and commuted to a sprawling glass skyscraper in the city's commercial district. There, I changed into the gray uniform of a commercial cleaning crew, grabbed a heavy mop and a bucket of harsh chemicals, and spent the hours until midnight scrubbing the offices of top executives. I washed panoramic windows overlooking a neon-lit metropolis, polished expensive leather chairs, and emptied trash bins overflowing with premium stationery scraps and empty bottles of high-end scotch. Sometimes, leaning on my mop in the middle of a luxurious boardroom, I would think, "It's okay. Soon my Sebastian will have an office just like this. He'll be interviewed, his face will be on magazine covers, and these very people will be lining up for his autograph." But Sebastian's demands kept expanding. 2 years later, his first novel, Traces on the Sand, was finally complete. He dispatched the manuscript to 10 major publishing houses. We waited for 3 agonizing months. Only 2 replied, with cold, automated rejection slips. "Your text does not align with our current commercial format. The prose is overly dense, and the pacing is sluggish." The rejection dealt a catastrophic blow to Sebastian. His ego, inflated by my blind devotion, could not digest the failure. He flew into a terrifying rage. That evening, he tore our studio apart, throwing ashtrays at the walls, shattering our only bathroom mirror, ripping his manuscript into tiny shreds, and barricading himself in his room, declaring that the world was full of talentless hacks determined to destroy him. I wiped the blood from his bruised knuckles, patched the scratches on the walls, swept up the glass, and taped the torn pages of his novel back together piece by piece. It was then that Sebastian announced he needed to break into high society. "A writer cannot evolve in a suffocating dump like this, Sylvia," he shouted, pacing the balcony and smoking heavily. He was wearing brand-new merino wool trousers that I had bought for him on an installment plan, having skipped buying myself a winter coat. I spent the entire winter shivering in an old thrift store jacket, layering 2 thin sweaters underneath. "I need connections. I must attend the International Literary Forum in Brussels. The leading European editors, talent scouts, and independent agents will all be there. The registration fee, flights, and hotel stay will run about €3,000. You have to find the money, Sylvia. This is our only shot at breaking through this blockade of mediocrity. If I don't go, I'll be left on the sidelines of life, and my talent will rot right here with you." €3,000. To me, it was an astronomical, impossible sum. My credit cards were maxed out to the absolute limit, and my friends had stopped answering my calls, knowing I was perpetually looking for loans. So, I took a third job. Night shift freelance proofreading, copy editing, and reviewing legal contracts and niche medical handbooks on an online gig board. My life disintegrated into a relentless, waking nightmare of sleep deprivation. I slept no more than 3 hours a day. My schedule was brutal. 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., the logistics hellscape at the warehouse. 8 p.m. to midnight, scrubbing floors in the corporate high-rise. At 1 a.m., I would crawl home, frantically meal prep Sebastian's lunch and dinner for the next day, wash the mountain of dirty dishes he deliberately left in the sink. My fingers are meant for the keyboard, Sylvia. If I submerge them in soapy dishwater, I lose my micromotor skills and tactile connection to the text. And from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., I sat under a dim desk lamp, squinting at dry, soulless legal jargon to catch typos. At 6 a.m., my alarm went off, and I walked right back to the bus stop. I managed to scrape together the €3,000. I brought him the envelope of cash while he lounges on the sofa, lazily scrolling through his newsfeed. His face brightened instantly. He snatched the money without once asking about the deep, dark circles bruising my eyes, why my hands were visibly trembling, or why I had dropped 2 dress sizes. He didn't offer an embrace. He simply counted the bills and gave an approving nod. "Excellent. At least you're proving useful. I'll book the morning flight. I still need to squeeze in a trip to the barber. A writer must look respectable when facing the European press." He flew to Brussels. He didn't bring back a book deal from that trip, but he brought back something far more lethal. He brought back an introduction to Xavier. Xavier was a literary agent well known in specific, ruthless circles. A cold, cynical man with a thin mustache and the immaculate manners of an apex predator. Xavier didn't care about art. Xavier cared about market trends, PR strategies, and audience retention metrics. He knew how to market books the way others marketed cryptocurrency or used cars, by weaving an aggressive, intoxicating mythos around the product. When Sebastian returned from Brussels, his demeanor shifted permanently. Any lingering trace of the performative warmth he used to display when he needed a favor vanished. He began looking at me as a minor, unavoidable nuisance, like a worn-out workhorse that couldn't be kicked off the farm just yet because it still hauled the supply wagon, but was too embarrassing to show to dignified guests. He locked himself in his study and began hammering out a new novel, working under the working title, The Glass Facade. The creation of this text was entirely different. Sebastian no longer threw tantrums or shattered dishes. He became chillingly methodical, detached, and hyper-focused. He sat at his desk for 14 hours a day, churning out page after page. I brought his meals on a tray, softly knocking on his door exactly 3 times, as we had agreed, so as not to disrupt his train of thought. He would crack the door open, silently take the plate without ever looking me in the eye, and slam it shut right in my face. During this period, I wasn't just his cook and financial backer. Thanks to my unfinished philology degree, I became his de facto personal editor and proofreader. Every night, while the genius slept, well-fed and deeply satisfied with his daily output, I sat at his desk. Our shared cloud storage had been set up during our first year together. He had it configured to automatically sync every new chapter. My task was to review the text with a fresh, critical eye. I trimmed away his heavy, self-indulgent prose, excised entire paragraphs of vanity, corrected logical and chronological plot holes, and rewrote flat, lifeless dialogue to make it sharp and incisive. I quite literally chiseled this raw, jagged block of text into a gem through my sleepless nights. The version history of those Google Docs held tens of thousands of my edits, highlighted in a sea of green. Without my editing, that novel would have remained an unreadable, leaden brick. I poured half my soul into that text. 18 months later, the novel was complete. Sebastian dispatched it to Xavier. The agent's response arrived within 48 hours. Xavier was ecstatic. The Glass Facade was hailed as a masterpiece of psychological suspense. Grand Books Publishing immediately drafted a contract, offering Sebastian an advance with more zeros than I had ever seen in my bank accounts. When Sebastian brought home a copy of the contract and pointed out the figure, I collapsed onto my knees right on the dirty welcome mat in the hallway and sobbed. I wept uncontrollably, covering my face with my hands, and they were tears of pure, unadulterated relief. I genuinely thought my personal 7-year hell had finally come to an end. I thought I could finally quit the warehouse, stop scrubbing office floors at midnight, lie down, and sleep for 12 hours straight. I thought we would finally buy me a new pair of shoes, take a trip to the ocean, which I hadn't seen in a decade, and simply begin living like a normal, happy married couple. Sebastian stood over me, holding the contract by its edge with 2 fingers, a look of profound, icy disgust for my tears washing over his face. "Sylvia, stop this dramatic kitchen scene at once," he said, his voice flat and cutting as he pushed past me into the living room. "This weeping, it's so vulgar, so profoundly pedestrian. My success isn't a lottery win. It is the logical culmination of my personal mental evolution. I bled for this text. I burned my soul to ash in that room while writing those chapters. I endured the absolute agony of isolation." "Yes, Sebastian," I smiled through my tears, rising from the floor and reaching out to wrap my arms around his shoulders. "We did it. We survived the nightmare together. Now all our struggles are behind us." He threw his hands up, flinching away from my touch with a sharp, rigid motion. His palms were smooth, soft, and meticulously manicured. Over those 7 years, they had known no labor other than striking the keys of a laptop. "Not we, Sylvia, I," he corrected me, his tone instantly freezing the blood in my veins. "In fact, we need to have a serious conversation about the future. Tomorrow, I am opening a new private bank account. Xavier insists on absolute financial independence for the author to prevent domestic distractions. All royalties and advances will be routed there. Furthermore, Next week is the exclusive, high-profile launch party for the novel, catering to top critics, media executives, and cultural influencers. You will not be attending. You are staying home. I froze in the center of the room, my mouth half open. The air suddenly felt thick and frigid, like liquid nitrogen. "What do you mean? I won't be there," I whispered, refusing to believe my ears. "But why, Sebastian? All these years." Sebastian sighed, settled into an armchair, and crossed his legs, adopting the patronizing posture of a seasoned academic explaining basic arithmetic to a slow student. "Try to understand this with your practical mind, Sylvia. Xavier has mapped out a flawless marketing strategy. The novel requires a powerful, haunting mythos. In the modern publishing landscape, the author's persona sells the book far better than the actual text. The world needs to see Sebastian as a solitary, suffering recluse, a dark, misunderstood philosopher who lived for years in a total mental vacuum, in an empty room, eye to eye with his inner demons, utterly despising material comforts. This concept captivates the intellectual elite, polarizes the press, and cultivates a cult following among readers. It's pure marketing, Sylvia." He stared me down, his eyes entirely devoid of warmth, containing nothing but cold, clinical calculation. "Now, picture this. I arrive at the launch party, and hovering next to me is an exhausted, weathered warehouse worker with chapped skin, zero styling, wearing a cheap dress, who starts babbling to journalists about how she cooked my stews, washed my socks, and paid our rent with her pathetic hourly wages. What does that do to my mythos? It annihilates it instantly. It degrades a high, pure tragedy of a lonely genius into a cliché, tacky domestic drama about a freeloading deadbeat and his nurturing meal ticket. Your appearance, your clothes, your manner of speaking, all of it drags my premium image down into the mud. It doesn't sell, Sylvia. The public doesn't want to read about a nagging wife who fed the genius dinner. The public wants drama. So, you will stay home, in the shadows. It's what's best for business, for my success." He stood up, picked up his cigarillos, and walked into his study, firmly shutting the door behind him. I stood paralyzed in the darkened hallway. In that exact moment, it felt as though a rusty, jagged blade had been plunged into my chest and twisted with a sickening wrench. 7 years of my life. 7 years of voluntary servitude, working myself to the bone without a single weekend or sick day, living in squalor, breaking my health across 3 jobs, and pulling all-nighters over his drafts. All of it erased with a single sentence and dismissed as a tacky domestic drama that drags a genius into the mud. I didn't cry. My tears dried up instantly, turning into a bitter, heavy, icy salt inside my veins. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold tap water, stared at my reddened hands and broken fingernails, and for the first time in 7 years, I asked myself one simple, terrifying question. What have I actually been to him all these years? And what exactly does he plan to do with me next, when the spotlights burn even brighter? The book launch took place the following Friday. Sebastian left the apartment just after noon, carefully carrying his new tuxedo in a garment bag. Before walking out, he didn't even glance my way. He simply tossed a $100 bill onto the kitchen table. "Buy yourself something nice for dinner, Sylvia. And please don't call me today. Xavier will have my phone, and he won't be answering unrecognized or home numbers to ensure I can focus entirely on networking with investors." I watched him from the window. A black premium rideshare, billed directly to the publisher, smoothly pulled away from our dilapidated building. Outside, a miserable gray drizzle was setting in. I didn't touch the $100 bill. Instead, I walked straight into his study. The room still hung heavy with the rich aroma of his luxury tobacco. His old loungewear had been carelessly discarded on the chair, tossed aside as he stepped into opulence. The desk was a chaotic mess of creative clutter that I was strictly forbidden to touch under threat of an explosive argument. But something else caught my eye. Resting at the edge of the desk was his old work laptop, the battered silver one with the chipped left corner that I had purchased on an installment plan 3 years ago using my credit card. I was still paying off the monthly interest to the bank. Sebastian hadn't taken it with him. The publishing house had issued him a brand new, ultra-thin flagship model. This old tool was now obsolete to him. I sat in his deep leather chair and lifted the lid. The screen flickered to life. Sebastian had always viewed me as a simple, pedestrian woman whose mind was entirely consumed by warehouse manifests and bathroom cleaners. He hadn't even bothered to set a login password or log out of his active accounts. In the bottom right corner of the desktop, our old shared cloud drive was actively syncing. My index finger glided across the trackpad. I opened the root folder of the drive. My eyes immediately locked onto a bizarre directory at the very bottom of the list. It was a hidden folder named with a single, unassuming period. Dot. An ordinary user would pass it right by, assuming it was a system rendering bug. But I knew Sebastian's habits all too well. Whenever he wanted to hide a draft he deemed a failure from me, he resorted to these exact technical parlor tricks. I double-clicked the folder. Inside lay a single text document titled plan_x_final.docx. The creation date was stamped 3 months prior, exactly 2 weeks before Grand Books Publishing officially greenlit the final print run of The Glass Facade. I opened the file. As my eyes raced across the text, it became increasingly difficult to draw breath. The air in the study felt like molten lead, searing my lungs. This wasn't a conceptual outline for a new novella. This was a cold, clinical, highly detailed business strategy for his upcoming PR campaign, meticulously synchronized with a step-by-step timeline for the liquidation of our marriage. The document had been co-authored by Sebastian and Xavier during their covert dinners at high-end restaurants, dinners that I, ironically, had funded through my midnight cleaning shifts. I read through the bullet points, feeling the final, lingering fragments of the naive, infatuated girl who had once believed in a suffering artist die a swift death inside me. PR, Strategy and Legal Risk Mitigation for Project The Glass Facade. Section 2. Establishing the media narrative. In all upcoming television, radio, and print interviews, the author, Sebastian, must maintain a rigid, uncompromising emphasis on the concept of absolute monastic solitude. Completely eliminate any mention of a legal spouse or long-term domestic relationship. For any direct inquiries regarding personal life, utilize the pre-approved script. My sole muse and companion is the ringing silence of abandoned rooms. A creator must walk alone. This narrative is projected to increase sales by 240% within the core target demographic: young women, luxury fiction readers. Section 5. Isolation of S. Sylvia. Strictly bar S from appearing at any public events, launch parties, or book signings. Should third parties inquire, cite severe introversion or a personal aversion to publicity. The visual presentation of S, physical exhaustion, signs of manual labor, lack of status-appropriate wardrobe, actively damages the premium tiering of the author's brand and lowers overall equity capitalization. Section 8. Asset protection and capital diversion. All incoming revenue streams, advances, first edition royalties, international rights, and potential film option liquidations must be routed exclusively to the offshore shell accounts of Xavier's entity, X Media Limited, or into a confidential private banking account under Sebastian's name. This process must be fully executed prior to the filing of the official dissolution of marriage. This precautionary measure effectively eliminates any legal risk of asset division with S during divorce proceedings. S must remain entirely blind to actual sales volumes. Section 11. Dissolution of marriage, liquidation. The optimal execution window is exactly 6 months post-peak sales, once the media narrative of the solitary genius has solidified into an undisputed public axiom. The official grounds for divorce in the legal filing will state, irreconcilable differences, extreme psychological and domestic coercion by the spouse, and mercenary financial demands that stifled the author's creative output and compromised his mental health. Section 12. Reputation management and crisis containment. In the event that S attempts to instigate a public controversy, assert marital claims, or leak details of the domestic arrangement, Xavier will deploy a pre-packaged counter-campaign across partner blogs and media outlets. S will be framed as a bitter, toxic domestic shackle who lacked faith in her husband's talent, caused financial friction, attempted to force him out of literature into menial labor, and is now attempting to extort a percentage of his hard-earned success. Compiled character witness statements, templates attached in Appendix 3, are ready for deployment. I sat motionless before the glowing screen. Tears didn't fall from my eyes, they simply froze somewhere deep within. My brain, hardened by years of logistics management where split-second decisions had to be made under the screaming tirades of freight drivers, instantly pivoted into a state of absolute, icy clarity. The man for whom I had broken my health, abandoned my education, and given the best years of my life across 3 jobs, was sitting in white linen restaurants with his slick agent, clinically plotting how to discard me like a piece of industrial waste without a single cent, all while preparing to assassinate my character before the entire country. They had calculated everything. They were masters of spin and public relations, but they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation that arrogant people always make when blinded by sudden success. They believed their own lie. They assumed that because I stayed silent and washed their dishes, I didn't have teeth. I reached into my bag and pulled out my work flash drive. With a calm, deliberate hand, I copied the entire hidden folder, including the exit strategy and the fraudulent witness templates. Then, I accessed the version history of The Glass Facade on Google Drive and exported the complete, comprehensive edit logs into an Excel spreadsheet. A log where every single one of my green editorial marks, every scene I had restructured, was stamped with down-to-the-second metadata. I closed the laptop, slipped the flash drive into my pocket, and checked the time. It was 7 in the evening. Downtown, Sebastian was likely raising a flute of vintage champagne to his monastic masterpiece. The play had begun, and I had just rewritten the final act. The following morning, instead of sleeping off my night shift of proofreading legal contracts, I traveled out to a bleak industrial sector on the edge of the city. I needed an attorney, but not one of those corporate lawyers in silk ties who charge $1,000 an hour to protect publishing empires. I needed a street fighter who knew how to wage war in the legal trenches. I found him on the 3rd floor of a weathered office block, right above a driving school. His name was Blake. He looked permanently disheveled, had thick, calloused hands, drank lukewarm coffee from styrofoam cups, and possessed a reputation as a merciless pit bull in high-stakes asset disputes. I sat down across from him and silently slid the flash drive across the desk. "What's this?" he asked gruffly, not looking up from a stack of manila folders. "The chronicle of 7 years of indentured servitude," I said softly, "and the blueprint for my social and financial execution." Blake grunted, slotted the drive into his outdated desktop tower, and began reading. For the first 5 minutes, he stared at the monitor in absolute silence, occasionally rubbing his jaw. By the 10th minute, he stopped scrolling. He raised his eyes to meet mine, and within them, I saw the sharp, predatory gleam of a seasoned litigator. "Your husband is a textbook sociopath, Sylvia," Blake stated flatly, leaning back in his creaking chair. "But his agent Xavier is an even bigger idiot. They were so blinded by their own cleverness that they left a paper trail documenting an explicit conspiracy to defraud a legal spouse. In a court of law, this exit plan isn't just evidence, it's a loaded gun pressed directly against their temples." "Can we freeze half?" I asked. "Half?" Blake let out a sharp, dark chuckle. "The statutory framework governing marital property in this jurisdiction is incredibly straightforward. Everything acquired during the marriage is split 50-50. But your situation cuts far deeper. Thanks to these metadata logs from Google Docs, we can file a claim that goes beyond basic asset division. We are going to sue for formal co-authorship and recognition as the primary venture investor. You aren't just a spouse, Sylvia. You are the venture capitalist who fully underwrote the startup known as Sebastian the Writer, while simultaneously acting as chief editor. Without your capital injection and editorial labor, this product literally would not exist on the market. But I need an airtight, auditable financial trail. Judges loathe poetry. They love numbers. Can you rebuild the complete financial ledger of your marriage? I can, I nodded. Give me 2 weeks. Done, Blake said, leaning forward. But remember, not a single word to your husband. No hints, no passive-aggressive comments, no shifts in your routine. You must remain the submissive, invisible wife they've already written off. Let them keep transferring funds to Xavier's offshore accounts. The more they move now, the stronger our case for grand larceny and fraudulent conveyance becomes. We will file our petition and a motion for an emergency asset freeze on the exact day they launch their marquee media push. We're going to catch them at the absolute peak. Those 2 weeks stretched my physical and psychological endurance to its absolute breaking point. I virtually stopped sleeping. By day, I managed freight dispatch at the warehouse. By evening, I scrubbed office floors. And by night, I became the forensic accountant of my own tragedy. I pulled records from 3 separate banking institutions, tracking every card I had used over the past 84 months. I ordered complete, certified archival statements for every single statement cycle. My desktop printer ran until dawn, spitting out thousands of pages of cold, hard data. Line by line, I mapped out the entire financial architecture of our marriage, a document Blake and I later finalized under the title, The True Price of Genius. The inflow ledger. This was a pristine, unbroken desert on Sebastian's side. 100% of the incoming capital had been generated by my accounts. Warehouse wages, commercial cleaning contracts, freelance editing. Next to his name, for all 7 years, the legal earnings column read 0. The creative infrastructure ledger. I extracted every receipt and bank wire associated with our apartment. Every month, strictly on the 7th, the rent was paid from my checking account. I compiled the bills for the high-speed fiber internet, the utilities, and even the premium cream-colored stationery he insisted on for printing his drafts, because ordinary paper stifled his tactile experience. The medical and maintenance ledger. I unearthed invoices from a private medical center from 2 years prior. Sebastian had contracted a severe bout of influenza, and I had funded his 2-week stay in a luxury private recovery suite using my credit card, a debt I spent 18 months paying off while skipping meals. He had claimed at the time that standard hospital walls were too sterile to foster artistic recovery. The direct brand investment ledger. The most critical piece of the puzzle. I gathered every single receipt for the entry fees of every literary contest and workshop he had entered early on. And finally, the exact airline tickets to Brussels where he met Xavier, purchased on a revolving credit line that I was still actively paying off. I appended a concise, clinical annotation to every single item and bound them into a massive navy blue ledger. It was a flawless, legally unassailable record of parasitic exploitation disguised as artistic devotion. Sebastian, meanwhile, was floating on air. He was rarely home, traveling between high-profile promotional events. When he did return, his behavior toward me resembled that of a feudal lord dealing with an uneducated housemaid. "Sylvia, my shirts need to be pressed with absolute precision," he barked, walking past me into his study one evening. "A network television crew is coming tomorrow to shoot promotional B-roll of my creative space. I need you completely out of the apartment from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening. Go sit in a park or something. God forbid someone from the network catches you looking like that in a domestic apron. It completely shatters the solitary aura Xavier and I have worked so hard to build." "Of course, Sebastian," I replied quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the iron. "I'll leave. I won't disrupt your solitude." He let out a self-satisfied grunt, entirely oblivious to the fact that the foundations of his crystal palace had already been rigged with dynamite, and the fuse was waiting to be lit. The perfect window arrived in early July 2026. Modern Review announced a major, 1-hour live-streamed interview with Sebastian on their flagship digital channel. The marketing blitz had reached a fever pitch. The glass facade had topped the national bestseller lists, Foreign translation rights had been licensed in 6 countries, and Hollywood trade publications were openly discussing an upcoming feature adaptation. Xavier was already counting his commissions, waiting for the quarter to close so he could finalize the offshore transfers. On the morning of the broadcast, I waited until Sebastian's car service arrived. The moment the front door clicked shut, I pulled 2 large suitcases out from the back of the closet. I packed my few personal belongings, old jeans, a handful of sweaters, my academic texts, and my old university notebooks. I didn't touch a single item purchased after his financial windfall. I refused to take anything bought with his tainted money. I called a moving van, transferred my luggage to a small, sunlit 10th-floor apartment I had quietly leased the week prior using my freelance savings, and walked away. By 4 in the afternoon, I was back on the old kitchen stool. I opened my laptop. The live stream was just beginning. Sebastian looked immaculate. The styling team had executed their brief flawlessly. The signature charcoal blazer, calculated 5 o'clock stubble, and a deep, brooding gaze. Sitting across from him was Beatrice, a legendary journalist whose razor-sharp interrogations routinely made politicians sweat. But today, even she had fallen under the spell of the solitary genius. "Sebastian, your novel is a hauntingly profound achievement," Beatrice said, her eyes filled with genuine professional admiration. "Tell us, how did you manage to maintain such incredible clarity of thought and artistic focus in a world full of constant digital distraction? Where did you unearth this raw, visceral understanding of human isolation?" Sebastian leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees and interlocking his fingers, staring directly into the camera lens, effectively looking right through the screen and into my eyes. "You see, Beatrice," his voice was smooth, resonant, and entirely persuasive. "My success is the direct product of absolute, distilled isolation. True art demands total detachment from earthly anchors. For 7 years, I existed in a complete, hermetic vacuum. There was nothing around me but the echoing silence of 4 bare walls. No friends, no family, no woman to drag the trajectory of my intellect down to earth with petty domestic demands, complaints, or anxieties over daily bread. I deliberately eradicated every social connection from my life, turning my back on comfort. I suffered alone with my demons, and it was that very crucible of isolation that allowed me to crystallize this masterpiece. A creator must share his space with nothing but the void." I looked down at my hands, at the chemical burns from the industrial cleaner, at the scar on my index finger from a kitchen knife, sustained while I rushed to chop his vegetables between consecutive work shifts. I glanced back at the screen, where my email client sat open in an adjacent window. My finger tapped the trackpad. Send! The 4-gigabyte archive, titled "The True Price of Genius," was instantly broadcast to 50 of the most influential outlets, critics, and legal divisions in the literary industry. Simultaneously, Blake walked through the doors of the circuit court to file our petition for co-authorship and an emergency asset freeze. I sat perfectly still, watching the live counter tick past 500,000 active viewers. Exactly 8 minutes elapsed. Sebastian was in the middle of an elegant monologue, analyzing the narrative architecture of his final chapter. I watched Beatrice glance down at the tablet resting on her lap. Her production desk was suddenly bombarding her with urgent alerts. Right there, on live camera, her seasoned broadcast demeanor fractured. Her eyebrows shot upward, her lips tightened into a hard line, and her eyes flashed with the predatory hunger of a top-tier investigative journalist, realizing she was sitting on the biggest media explosion of the year. Her fingers flew across the screen, scanning the bank ledgers and Google Docs metadata that had just hit her inbox. In the live chat below the video, chaos erupted. The comments began scrolling at such a frantic velocity that the text blurred into a vertical strobe of light. A production assistant, having reviewed my leak, had forwarded the files to the major media channels, and the internet was melting down in real time. "Sebastian!" Beatrice interrupted him mid-sentence. Her voice was no longer warm. It dropped with the heavy metallic thud of a guillotine blade hitting wood. Sebastian halted, blinking in confusion. Yes, Beatrice? We are witnessing something entirely unprecedented unfolding during this live broadcast, the host said, turning her tablet screen directly toward the main studio camera. Literally moments ago, our editorial board, major literary columnists, and the executive suite at Grand Books Publishing received a comprehensive dossier and archive from your legal wife, Sylvia. Sebastian froze. Even beneath the professional studio makeup, I could see the color draining from his face, turning a sickly, ash gray. According to these certified documents, Beatrice continued, her tone laced with a cold, undisguised professional relish, including audited bank ledgers spanning the last 84 months, your total monastic isolation was entirely financed by your wife, who worked 3 jobs simultaneously, as a logistics coordinator, a nighttime corporate janitor, and a freelance legal proofreader. Furthermore, the dossier includes an internal document titled Exit Plan, authored by you and your agent Xavier, detailing an explicit strategy to conceal your royalties in offshore accounts to leave your wife destitute, while orchestrating a media smear campaign to frame her as a mercenary shackle. How do you account for this void of yours, Sebastian? An absolute, suffocating silence fell over the studio. The ambient hum of the lighting rig seemed to amplify. Sebastian stared at Beatrice, his eyes wide with a primal, naked terror. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping on dry land. This is defamation, he finally stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She's an unstable woman. She's envious. This is a coordinated hit. The Unstable Woman has provided the complete version history of your manuscript on Google Drive, where her editorial footprint is stamped on every single page, Beatrice countered, delivering the final, crushing blow. It appears your masterpiece was bought with her wages and structurally rewritten by her hands while you were busy contemplating your atmosphere. Sebastian, we have 500,000 people watching this stream right now, and your glass facade has just shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sebastian lunged forward blindly, attempting to wrench himself out of his chair. He snagged his lavalier cord, sending his glass of ice water crashing to the floor, shattering instantly and soaking the expensive studio rug. The broadcast cut abruptly to a commercial slate. I closed my laptop lid. I stood up from the stool and took one final look around the grim, smoke-stained kitchen where I had abandoned 7 years of my life. I picked up my handbag, walked out into the corridor, dropped the apartment keys into the mailbox, and pulled the heavy iron door shut behind me. My role in his book was over. It was time to start writing my own. The aftermath of that live broadcast felt like a massive kinetic strike on a house of cards. Within 48 hours, the literary world transformed from a welcoming elite circle into a hostile arena for Sebastian and Xavier. By the next morning, #TruePriceOfGenius and #TheGlassFacade were trending globally. The public reaction was fierce, fueled by a visceral disgust for the cold-blooded cynicism laid bare in the plan_x_final.docx file. The solitary genius narrative had curdled into a toxic symbol of parasitic entitlement. Grand Books Publishing acted with corporate ruthlessness. By noon, their legal department issued an official press release stating they were freezing all marketing campaigns, halting the second print run of The Glass Facade, and launching an internal investigation into the authorship logs. The book was quietly pulled from the front displays of major retailers and moved to the bargain bins before vanishing from shelves altogether. Hollywood executives tracking the project immediately backed out. The production company that had been negotiating a film option tore up the draft agreement, stating they refused to be associated with a brand predicated on exploitation and systemic fraud. Xavier attempted to weather the storm by issuing a heavily sanitized legal statement, claiming he was merely exploring standard risk mitigation frameworks for a high-profile client without malicious intent. It didn't work. Within a week, 3 of his top best-selling authors publicly fired him, citing an inability to trust an agent who engineered financial fraud against a spouse. His boutique agency went under before the month was out. But the real war was just beginning in the sterile, wood-paneled rooms of the family court. The legal confrontation didn't happen in a grand courtroom before a roaring crowd. It took place in a quiet, air-conditioned conference room on the 12th floor of the municipal courthouse. Sebastian sat across from me, flanked by a court-appointed public defender. Xavier's high-priced corporate lawyers had abandoned him the moment his offshore accounts were frozen by Blake's emergency injunction. The transformation in Sebastian was shocking. The pristine charcoal blazers were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting, wrinkled shirt. The artfully tousled hair looked genuinely unkempt, and the pale, aristocratic face was now hollow, marked by dark purple shadows of insomnia and desperation. He wouldn't look me in the eye. He stared fixedly at the polished mahogany table, his long, slender fingers nervously tracing the grain of the wood. Blake sat next to me, exuding the calm, predatory confidence of an engineer who knew his bridge was unshakable. He opened his thick briefcase and pulled out the navy blue ledger we had meticulously constructed. The true price of genius. He slammed it down in the center of the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Here is the reality, Sebastian," Blake began, his voice flat and unyielding. "We aren't just discussing a standard asset split anymore. We have filed formal claims for co-authorship backed by verifiable digital metadata, alongside a civil suit for fraudulent conveyance and conspiracy to defraud a legal spouse. If this goes to a full trial, the evidentiary record will become public domain. The metadata logs prove Sylvia edited, restructured, and fundamentally rewrote over 40% of the final text. The financial ledgers prove she underwrote your entire existence for 7 years. If a judge sees this exit plan, you aren't just looking at losing your royalties, you're looking at a potential criminal referral for asset concealment." Sebastian's attorney leaned over, whispered urgently in his client's ear for 2 minutes, and sighed. He looked up at Blake. "What are your terms?" Blake slid a single sheet of paper across the table. The terms were uncompromising. Financial restitution, 100% of the initial publishing advance, and all current domestic royalties accrued to date were to be transferred immediately to my sole account as compensation for direct capital investment and editorial labor. Future rights, 50% of all future international rights, translations, and any potential secondary exploitation of the glass facade would be routed to my estate in perpetuity. Public rectification. In all future editions of the book, should it ever be re-released, my name would stand alongside his on the cover, by Sebastian and Sylvia. Sebastian flinched as he read the cover requirement. For a man whose entire identity was built on the delusion of singular, unadulterated genius, sharing the cover with the woman he had dismissed as a pedestrian shackle was a fate worse than bankruptcy. "Sylvia, please," he suddenly choked out, his voice cracking as he looked up at me for the first time. His eyes were wide, desperate, and entirely pathetic. "You're destroying my life. You're erasing me. Literature is all I have. If you take this away, I have nothing left. I'll be ruined forever." I looked at him across the table. For 7 years, this man's opinions, tantrums, and artistic whims had dictated the entire rhythm of my heartbeat. I had broken my body, sacrificed my youth, and abandoned my own mind just to keep his fragile ego afloat. And now, looking at him, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hatred, no lingering bitterness, just a vast, hollow vacuum of indifference. The God I had worshipped on that altar was just a small, fragile, selfish man who couldn't even stand up under the weight of his own actions. "You aren't being destroyed by me, Sebastian," I said softly, my voice calm and steady. "You are simply being introduced to the bill for services rendered. For 7 years, you ate my food, lived under my roof, and used my mind to write your pages, while plotting how to throw me into the street without a dime. You wanted absolute monastic isolation? Well, now you have it. Sign the papers." His hands shook violently as his attorney handed him the pen. It took him 3 attempts to sign his name on the dotted line. When he finished, he dropped the pen, buried his face in his soft, manicured hands, and began to weep silently. I stood up, fastened my coat, and walked out of the room without looking back. By September 2026, the storm had completely cleared. I settled into my new apartment on the 10th floor. It was small, but it was bright, filled with sunlight that streamed through large windows overlooking a quiet public park. There were no mountains of dirty dishes, no lingering smell of heavy tobacco, and no stifling cloud of someone else's fragile ego hanging over the rooms. The air smelled of clean linen, fresh coffee, and old books. Thanks to the financial settlement, I immediately resigned from the freight terminal and the midnight cleaning shifts. The physical exhaustion that had settled deep into my bones over 7 years began to lift, brick by brick. My skin regained its color, the chemical burns on my hands healed into faint silver scars, and for the first time in a decade, I slept a full, unbroken 8 hours every single night. I didn't waste any time. I returned to my university's graduate division. The dean, who remembered my abrupt departure 7 years prior, welcomed me back with open arms. My stored research notes on Silver Age literature were pulled from the bottom drawer, dusted off, and laid out on my new desk. Today, I sat in the university library, surrounded by the comforting, rhythmic rustle of turning pages and the soft scratching of pens. A fresh, clean Microsoft Word document sat open on my laptop screen. The cursor blinked rhythmically against the stark white background, waiting. I glanced out the window. Down below, autumn leaves were drifting across the cobblestone paths of the campus. My phone buzzed softly on the wooden table. It was a Google alert. A tiny, local cultural blog had published a short feature on forgotten figures in contemporary art. Near the bottom was a brief mention of Sebastian. He was currently living in a bleak, rented room on the far industrial outskirts of the city, working an entry-level shift as a remote copywriter for an obscure retail catalog, writing short, rigid promotional sentences for plastic storage boxes and garden hoses to pay his monthly rent. His muse, it appeared, had vanished the moment the kitchen stopped being taken care of by someone else. I smiled faintly, turned off the screen of my phone, and slipped it into my bag. I leaned forward, placed my hands on the keyboard, and began to type the very first sentence of my doctoral dissertation. The words flowed effortlessly, sharp, precise, and entirely my own. The prologue of my real life had finally ended. It was time to write the first chapter. Every perfect facade hides a dark secret. What would you do in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe to Storytime Drama, and stay tuned, because our next story will shock you even more. See you soon!